Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today we're going to be looking at the story of Jacob and Esau. Now, Jacob and Esau were twins, and they are the grandsons of Abraham and the sons of Isaac and Rebekah, just so we kind of keep things in order here in terms of where we are and the overall story. As it turns out that Abraham found a wife, Rebekah, for his son Isaac. And when Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, if you'll recall. And now they're married, but we find that Isaac is about 60 years old before he was 40 years old when he was married, and he's about 60 years old now when these two boys were born to them. And which tells us that he had a kind of a similar situation as with Abraham and Sarah. You know, they were expecting this child, and God promised them a child, but it took them 25 years before they saw that come to fulfillment. So for some reason, we find that Isaac and Rebekah are pretty much in the same boat. You know, they were married when he was around 40, and you would expect right away that they would have wanted to start having children, but it became a real concern. And so to the point where Isaac goes before God and he prays for Rebekah, and he's, you know, I guess when you pray, that means you're really concerned about something. What is it people say? We usually pray when things get so bad, and that's the only time we ever pray. But things were bad enough so that Isaac came before God and on behalf of his wife prayed. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife. This is in Genesis 25, 21 to 22, because she was childless. And the Lord did answer his prayer. Rebekah became pregnant. And we see there's something a little unusual about this particular pregnancy, because it goes on to tell us that the babies, in verse 22, the babies jostled each other within her. And she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. What this tells us is that there was something wasn't quite right. Now, I know this was the first time that Rebekah had children. These were her first children. So she wouldn't have had any reference point, you know, any way to determine really if this was right or wrong, but it must have been so different, and, you know, based on what she saw other women experiencing, that she was really concerned and maybe a little bit frightened because of all this activity that was going on inside her. It just was not normal. And so, just like Isaac went to God to pray for her that they would have children, she goes to the Lord to inquire of what is going on here. She really wants to know. She seeks the Lord. And God does not disappoint her. The Lord said to her in verse 23, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Now imagine what it would be like if you know you're going to have a kid. You know, we're kind of at the point most normally where you know you're going to have a kid, but that's the only thing you know. You don't really know what this kid's going to be like. Well, of course, today we can tell the gender because of ultrasounds and all this stuff. Of course, when God is involved, he doesn't need an ultrasound. He told her that there's going to be these two boys within her, which is kind of a good thing to know, I guess. There's two of them in there. Maybe that's why she felt so much commotion. And it's kind of reassuring just to know, you know, God assures her that everything's going to be okay. Might not be normal, but it's going to be okay. And I'm sure that would have been a great blessing to her. But it's not the first time that God has, I guess you could say, prophesied about what is going to happen for someone. And we saw that with Ishmael. We were just talking about that, how even when he was young, the Lord explained to Abraham that Ishmael would go on to be a nation, that he would have 12 sons, and it even went on to say about how his temperament was going to be a little bit on the wild side. And sure enough, all those projections and all those predictions come true. Of course, God knows about these things. And but most of the time we're kind of in the dark in terms of what our kids are going to be like. But this was a special occasion. You saw the same thing with actually John the Baptist, and his father was told by an angel that he was going to have a son. He was going to play a very special role in being that prophet that came before Jesus, and that's exactly what happened. Of course, Jesus himself, Mary and Joseph, the angel comes to Joseph and he said, your wife Mary will conceive, she'll have a son, you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. This was big news for them. And it was helpful, though, because they knew God was doing something special. And I think this probably was somewhat of a comfort to Rebecca, just to know that God is there. He's got his hand on all this stuff. So don't worry. These two nations are in your womb. Must have been something that made her think a little bit. But we've already seen that in this promise that God made to Abraham, that from you will come many nations. So really, I guess this is part of that promise being fulfilled as well. So what happens next? Verses 24, starting in verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. The word Esau implies being hairy. I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea of having a kid that you name after his hairy appearance. Well, anyway, this is what happened, and that he had this red hair that we're going to find out as well, which really would have made him stand out physically amongst everybody. And then we continue on. After this, his brother came out with a hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So, as we said, this is how we know that it's been 20 years since they were married before they actually have these children. And it must have been a real blessing to them to finally see these children being born. But we also know that these were definitely not identical twins. Jacob, actually his name means grabber. And that's just a reference to what happened when they were being born. I mean, this is probably a little out of the ordinary when it comes to, twins being born, is that one of them is actually grabbing on the heel of the other one. You can really get the idea that there was not a lot of harmony within this brotherhood here, and we're going to find out as they get older that that's exactly the case. So what happens? Well, we go through, after some time, the two boys grew up in verses 27 and 28, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. I mean, parents have to be equal opportunity employers. We can't say I love one more than the other, and I think I can honestly say that. I have 3 kids, and I see that they are different, and I love them, I guess, in a way, different ways. But I can't say that. I would never say one of them is my favorite. And if I did, I don't know if that would be necessarily a good thing. There was a comedy act, the Smothers Brothers. They used to sing, and the younger brother would always say, "Mom loved you more than she loved me." So that really wouldn't be a good thing if any kid got the sense that they were either less loved or more loved. But this is how it was. And I think I can understand, in a sense, because Isaac is looking at his son Esau, who is this mighty hunter. He's an outdoor guy, and he's going out with his spear and bow and arrow and bringing home game. And that would have been a big status symbol in that day and in that culture. But I think it also sort of implies that he has this more like a wild side to him. He's happy to go off and disappear for a few days and then come back with hopefully something that he's killed or slayed and can share it with everyone. On the other hand, Jacob is described as being more of a homebody, I guess. He's a little more domestic, and for this reason he's probably hanging out with Rebekah a lot more, and they develop a relationship. So it's natural, I guess, to understand why it says that Rebekah loved Jacob and Isaac loved Esau. And I don't think it's that they despised either of their children. It's just they had this special attraction towards one or the other. Well, what happens next? Now, this is where we get into the story between Jacob and Esau, and we see something more revealed about the relationship that they have with each other, which isn't necessarily that great. In verses 29 and 30. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." And that is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." Well, first of all, the name Edom is kind of a nickname, and it means red. So Esau has this nickname, and he has this very clear identity. And you have this, I guess, an imbalance in terms of the attention they would get from either of the parents. Now, Jacob is thinking, I think, a little more towards the future, and he sees an opportunity here in this situation when Esau comes to him and really is sort of, I don't know how hungry he was or how starved he really was. I guess he must not have had a lot of luck at this hunting trip when he came home, but he felt like maybe he was going to die, and he begs his brother for some food. And this is where there's something wrong in this relationship, because if any brother would come to his brother and ask him for food if he was starving, most of the time the brother would give it to his brother, but not in this case. And I think it's a reflection on this dynamic between these two that the Lord prophesied there would be this contention between them. And so he puts a price on this little bowl of stew, and the price is Esau's birthright. Now, as the firstborn, technically he was the firstborn because he came out first, according to the custom of the day, and we've mentioned that before. He would have received the greatest inheritance. In this case, it's called the birthright. That would have naturally gone to him. But I think there was this jealousy. This was an issue probably between Jacob and Esau. And that Jacob was, maybe that's why he was grabbing onto Esau's heel, because he wanted to be the firstborn even when he was in the womb. I don't know. But he sees it as an opportunity to get what he really wanted. And that was, and maybe this word grabber goes beyond just what he was doing as during the birth process. Maybe it was more of an indication of his temperament and something about his nature that he wanted to grab on and possess as much as he could. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'm not sure. But this is the deal that he works out. He takes advantage of this situation, and this was Esau's response in verses 32 to 34. He said, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" And then Jacob goes on to say how he made him swear on a formal oath that he would give up his birthright for this bowl of soup. And now at this point, that's where this story ends. Now, it doesn't actually end. There's more to it that we'll be getting to in the future, but this is how chapter 25 ends, and so this is where we'll end this part of the story. But it's interesting, just as when we looked at people like Noah and Abraham, and we could go to the New Testament and we could get an account in the New Testament of how these New Testament people remembered people like Noah and Abraham. There's also an account of Jacob and Esau in the book of Hebrews. And it gives us a little more information, I guess a little more insight into what actually was going on. So this is found in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 16 to 17. And the writer is encouraging people to live good lives. And he was actually using Esau as a bad example. He's implying, I guess, that Esau was not the most upright person. See to it that no one is immoral or godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. And afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit his blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. So this gives us a little more insight into the nature of Esau, in that in terms of his relationship with God, he didn't see this whole birthright thing as being all that important, which kind of an indication to me is that he wasn't really in tune with what was going on in his family, that his grandfather Abraham had received these wonderful promises from God. And I think Isaac was very much aware of that. And now you come down to this generation, and it seems like Esau was just more concerned about, day by day living and not really looking to the future or worrying about this type of a thing. And I think that idea and that picture of him is reinforced here in this passage in Hebrews, that he is described as godless in having this value system where a pot of stew is worth more to him than his birthright. And of course it goes on to say how he regrets that, as probably the next day. You see people that go out and buy a car and they have this term called buyer's regret, and then the day after you wonder, should I have done that or not? Well, I'm sure this went way beyond buyer's regret. This was something that he would have to live with for the rest of his life, this decision, this rash decision that he makes, based on kind of a temporary situation. On the other hand, we see this characteristic within Jacob to be more forward thinking, to be thinking more about the future, and maybe being a little treacherous in the way that he gets this birthright. So I think we have issues. We have personality issues between both of these guys. But nevertheless, this is the perspective that we get from the book of Hebrews. There's one more place, and we'll end with this, in Romans chapter 9, verses 10 to 12. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac, and yet, before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told that the older will serve the younger. In case you got lost there, that's a little bit wordy. But the point that's being made here is that God made it clear to Rebekah that this was not going to be a normal situation, that the older is going to serve the younger. And again, we mentioned how, according to the custom of the day, it would be the younger who would serve the older, but in this case, things got turned around a little bit. And we actually, there are some other examples of how God does things in his own way. We remember that God is sovereign, and he doesn't always work by the conventions of men. We saw that with David, in the story of David, when Samuel was told that one of Jesse's sons is going to be the next king of Israel. And when he goes there, this is a whole nother story that we haven't got to yet, but preview. When he goes there, he sees that Jesse has, I don't know, a ton of sons, and he looks at every single one of them, and some of them were like, really strong warriors. They were in the army, and he doesn't feel right about any one of them. And he has to ask Jesse, are these the only sons you have? And then Jesse, well, we've got David. He's out there in the field taking care of the sheep. He's the youngest one. And, according to the thinking of the day, the younger you are, the farther you are in birth order, the less value you seem to have in the eyes of your parents. But Samuel said, bring him to me. And it turns out that that's the one that God chose. Even though, according to human thinking, he would have been the last one that God would have chosen. All of this to say that God is sovereign, and he does things in his own way. I guess maybe to conclude, these are stories that we read, and they are things that really happened, and we learn a lot of things about God and the way he does things. But what do we take home for ourselves? How can we apply this to ourselves? Knowing that God is sovereign and seeing this example of God explaining to Rebecca everything that's going to be happening with these boys that she's about to give birth to. I think what we can take home from that is that we get born, and I know when my parents had me, no angel came to them and said, and you shall name him Lowell, and he shall be a pastor and a contractor, and they didn't get any of that. They just had to sort of wait and see, and that's how it is with all of us. You just sort of have to wait and see how you turn out. But I think what we can take home from this is this understanding that when God looks at each one of us, just like he looked at Esau and Jacob, and he knew he had a job for each one of them to do, he has a purpose for each one of us. And I've said this before, that it's not just our job, it's not just these temporal things that we should be concerned about, but if we really want to have joy and this purpose in life, that God does have something in mind for each one of us. And when we prayerfully consider what that is, I think you add a whole new dimension to your life. And maybe this is the one lesson that we can take home, that God is sovereign, and he's in control of everything. And he's in control of, I guess let's put it this way, he gives us free will. So he's not going to control us like you can control a robot. He gives us the opportunity, as we've said before, to make our own decisions about what we're going to do with our lives. But just to know that there is this ideal that God has for us, and that when the closer you get to following that, I think the happier and the more purpose you'll have in your life. So anyway, as I said, this is kind of like the first half of the story, this whole story between Jacob and Esau, and a lot more things happen, which we'll be getting to in the future. So I hope you will be able to join us once again at Gen Z Bible class.